So I decided to break this video up into several parts, two at least, because there just was so much material that came out of what I'd been looking into. And there's always this question that is lingering about the Watchtower claims, about the Bible student claims. What is the truth of the matter? And I think it comes down to personalities, what we see about the individuals, not the aura, not the build up around them that others have built up. For example, in the Bible students movement that I grew up in, Russell was the Laodicean messenger. You couldn't say anything bad about Brother Russell. You had to call him Brother Russell. If you called him Russell, that was evidence that you didn't respect and honor him. He was the wise and faithful servant that fed the true brethren with meat in due season, and he was revered as the seventh messenger. That he had a biblical stature, and this extreme to which Bible students built up Russell was such that if you didn't revere him, you were really you were on your way out of the truth. You weren't really a true disciple of the Lord, and it was extreme. But when you grow up in something like that, you don't realize how extreme it really is. So to you, it's normal. You know, you're born and raised in this thing. Your whole family is. Had to get one of the rare flyovers. We used to get a lot of jets, but since COVID, it's a rare thing to see a jet fly over the house now. So let's continue on a little bit more from picking up where we left off, because this thing led me into a lot of stuff I really didn't know. So let's go on and take a look at a little bit more of some of the analysis I did. When we left off, I had this chart up that showed the frequency of the use of the word or name Jehovah in the Watchtower magazine for a given year, divided by the number of pages for the magazine in that year. So it's a Jehovah density index, and you can see certain patterns that have emerged in this graph at different points, different periods in the history of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. And the first era was 1879 to 1916 under Charles Taze Russell. And we could see that there was an inflection point sometime around 1903, 1904, in that period there, where there was an increasing usage. And every time we see an increase in usage, it seems to correspond to a greater, let's say, autocratic control by the leadership in the society, or at least that trend or tendency to. So whether or not the one is truly connected to the other, it's interesting that when things become a little bit more autocratic, the frequency and the use of Jehovah in the Watchtower is greater, and it seems to correlate or correspond to different notable periods of the Watchtower's history. For example, right around 1916, you see a very definite increase at the point in time when Joseph Rutherford took control as president. And once he had cemented himself, and those Bible students that were loyal to Russell were pretty much purged from the society, you could see at that point they became Jehovah's Witnesses. It marked a new period in the society's history from 1931 through to about 1980, when the Watchtower corporate leadership no longer had control of the movement. And from 1980 on, the turmoil and the shift in government of the Watchtower from the corporate entity to the governing body is reflected at a time when Raymond Franz was asked to leave the society, and he was connected. He was one of the governing body members at a time when there was a greater internal turmoil within let's say, a struggle for control over the Watchtower and over the movement, and a greater degree of criticism of Watchtower doctrine. And Raymond Franz really was a victim of the turmoil that was the struggle that was going on in the leadership and the control of the Watchtower Society. And then from that period on, as the governing body had cemented its control over the movement, it faced another challenge, because in the 1990s into the 2000s, there was a greater, let's say, availability of information about the society and its doings, and that resulted in a lot more instability within the society and a greater need for the governing body to exercise more control over the body of Jehovah's Witnesses. So we see an increase here also that tends to correspond with that greater degree of control, autocracy, the use of ostracism as a punishment for those that didn't conform to Watchtower expectations, and the culture demands, really. There was you can see that there was an increase in the frequency of the term Jehovah in the Watchtower itself, as the governing body was struggling with apostasy and the trouble that apostates were causing in terms of an increasing body of witnesses leaving the society, leaving the movement. Again, Pew Research indicated that Jehovah's Witnesses were the highest revolving door religion in the United States. More people were leaving and coming into the religion, into the body of the movement, than any other Christian religion. So the governing body is attempting to stem this instability in membership by becoming more autocratic. Now with this chart, this is a corollary chart that analyzes the use of the word Jehovah with, let's say, its counterpart, God. Both words refer to the same entity, and I just wanted to see if there was a pattern or a trending that that might be suggestive or insightful into the society and its operation. And by looking at the ratio of the number of times the word Jehovah is used in the Watchtower for a given year versus God. And as you can see, there was a sudden increase during the 1920s, during Judge Rutherford's period, where there was a much greater tendency to refer to God as Jehovah, and much less inclined to use the word God. Although there's some variability in there, you can see some declines through Rutherford's period in the 1930s to his death. Again, in the 50s, you began to see an increase. These little roller coaster humps, it's a little hard to know what's causing them. It's possible that corresponds to the release of the New World translation of the Bible. Where they tended to use Jehovah more frequently in the Bible, I think it's possible that increase in frequency there during the 50s to use Jehovah may reflect the Watchtower's release of the New World Bible. But then during the 1960s to the present time, there's almost an exponential growth in the relative use of the word Jehovah to God, and it's almost exclusively Jehovah at this point. You very rarely in a Watchtower article or Watchtower issue will you find the word God. It's always almost exclusively Jehovah, and I think that this is maybe more reflective of the increasing trend of the the organization to be more and increasingly cult-like, with more cult-like tendencies, controlling the language, referring to God in a different way from other Christians, exclusively using the term Jehovah rather than God. And we know that the organization has become increasingly cultish, as we define a cult in terms of developing its own language, the language that the individuals use, like the kind of Bible speak. A good example of that is a recent interview from a young individual who just left the Jehovah's Witnesses. The video is found elders in my driveway. He kept referring to the doctrine as the truth, to the movement as the truth, and that's exactly the same kind of language the Bible students use. We're in the truth, or he's in the truth. Was a typical phrase used by Bible students. So the Bible students have their own language that they use, and the same with Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, it's almost identical, and that's not something to be unexpected, because they really both sects, even though they don't recognize one another, they originated from the same background. You could see that during Russell's era, in the first 30 or 40 years of the Watchtower's existence, there was an infrequent, almost even use of Jehovah with God, and maybe even less so, because you could see the ratios very low. But that definitely changes with Rutherford, and it's actually still increasing. It's getting to the point where the use of God is almost as a reference to the Almighty in the Bible is almost negligible compared to Jehovah. It's almost exclusively Jehovah. So it could be that this chart, again, I'm not speaking adamantly, it's just an interesting phenomena here, but it could be reflective or maybe an indicator that that the organization is increasingly becoming cultish. Now here's the last chart I'm going to throw up for consideration, and this is something that I actually originally found on JW Facts. There is a segment or page associated with JW Facts that goes into the memorial counts, and I found it interesting that how much the organization had grown in the early years. I wanted to get a sense of what it was like during the time when the Bible students were still a major portion of the Watchtower, still associated. It wasn't a sudden split. Yes, you had individuals like P.S.L. Johnson break off and form their own movements. And unlike what, again, I'll say it again, unlike what Watchtower asserts, they note that these split off organizations like the Pastoral Bible Institute and the Layman's Home Missionary, they acknowledge their existence. They don't name them, but they identify that they did exist. They did split. But they say that they didn't succeed. Well, in a sense, they did. They're still in existence today, although the PBI did pretty much phase out. Layman's Home Missionary, the organization directly descended from that group, is still in existence today, and so is the movement that formed in the 1930s from the Dawn Bible Students Ecclesia, or Dawn Bible Students Association. That they're still in existence today. So what I did with this chart was Paul Grundy only had from like 1922 or 3 on to 1928 to show the precipitous drop in the numbers as a result of the failed prophecy of 1925. But I think there was a little more going on than just that. I don't think that was entirely accountable. The failed prophecy was entirely accountable for this precipitous drop that you see here between 1927 and 28. Remember, in 1975, there was almost an immediate decline in numbers for about 2 or 3 years after 1975. The numbers of Jehovah's Witnesses didn't increase until around 1978, 79, and then the pattern of growth resumed. But this doesn't show immediate immediate decline in 1925, when the prediction for the ancient worthies, their resurrection, the expectation that they would be resurrected and take rule of the world, that the kingdom would be established, that Armageddon would come and sweep away the remnants of the world, and God's kingdom would be established. All of that was supposed to have happened in 1925. You see a small decline, but not much. It pretty well leveled off at around 90,000 members for several years after. And then in 1928, a sudden decline. And that was interesting to me. Why this delay? Why wasn't there a delay in 1975? There was an immediate impact in 1975, but here there wasn't an immediate impact. Maybe a little, but not dramatically. Not as dramatically as it was in 1975. So that's a big question. Now, in this particular chart, I went a little beyond Paul Grundy. I wanted to see what it was like, and if I could get memorial figures for earlier years and in the 1930s. And it was more difficult to get the numbers in the 1930s. It seemed to me that once 1928 came about, and there was this huge precipitous drop. It turns out to be about a 78% drop between 1927 and 1928. Rutherford deliberately withheld the numbers from Jehovah's Witnesses so that they wouldn't see what the condition of the society was in at that point. It almost took an entire decade to get back to the original numbers. And in fact, 1940 was the first time since 1925 where the memorial figures broke 90,000. So it took a long time for the society to recover from whatever happened in 1928. And I suspect that what it was that occurred during the 1920s was a planned, a very carefully planned coup, in a sense, if you want to call it that, a very deliberate approach or strategy that was employed by Rutherford to sift out or strip out those who were die-hard loyal Russellites. And I believe that around 1928, that was a very deliberate purge on the part of Rutherford to rid the organization of those whose loyalty remained with Russell. Again, remember, Russell was this mythical figure, almost deified by the Bible students, by many of the Bible students. Another point I want to make on this particular chart is that I did get some memorial figures from earlier watchtowers. They were reporting, but incompletely. The only report that really appeared to be more complete, and in fact the Watchtower indicated so, was the 1915 report, where it indicates there were 15,000 memorial partakers in the world. And before that, the numbers are a little less accurate. They reflect more of the larger gatherings, more of the larger groups with larger ecclesias that reported. All ecclesias did report in, but Watchtower didn't publish complete numbers all the time. But it gives you an idea, though, of the size, the relative size. 1906, you see almost 7,000, 5,000, 5,000 in 1910. And then you begin to see more of an upward trend. You see almost 8,000 in 1913, again, double that in 1915. 1917 is there's 21,000. So you're beginning to see a very definite increase in the number of people interested in the Watchtower and joining and participating in the memorial. And at that time, it was unlike the memorials held by Jehovah's Witnesses today, where it is a very rare thing for anyone to see somebody partaking of the emblems. Everybody at that time believed that they were running for the high calling, as they called it. And so nearly everybody who attended the memorial were memorial partakers. These were those who believed that they were part of the 144,000. And it was almost exclusively, the movement was almost comprised exclusively of those individuals until the late 1920s and early 1930s. And that's when things began to split apart, because those that believed that the harvest message was really exclusively to only those who had a hope for being part of the 144,000. So that was pretty much the state of things. By the early 1930s, you began seeing a decline in the proportion of those who partook of the memorial versus those that attended. And the movement was becoming increasingly made up of members who believed that initially they were called Jonadabs, but those that hoped to have an earthly inheritance, that they weren't expecting to be part of one of the 144,000. Although there were always some. There was always a number of individuals within the Watchtower Society that partook of the memorial. That relative proportion rapidly declined. And by the 1950s, almost nobody was considered to be part of the high calling. They weren't called Jonadabs anymore. They were the great multitude, and those who expected to have an earthly existence, a perfect earthly existence. Those that were expected to survive Armageddon and inherit the earth. So it's interesting, because you could see now that the Watchtower had actually transformed into an organization with a message that appealed to a great number of individuals, and you didn't have any doctrinal problems. Let's say Watchtower, let's say Rutherford, and I think this was Rutherford's genius, and it was probably deliberate. It was something that I believe Russell would have had to have done in order to grow the Watchtower into an organization that I think he envisioned. The big change was when Rutherford interpreted the great multitude as those that had an earthly hope, and this allowed for the Watchtower to expand. There's no limit to the numbers of potential converts. On the other hand, the way Russell's message was focused to only 144,000. So anybody joining into the Watchtower while Russell was alive, and during the 20s, while his message was the predominant message until the Jonadabs came into existence, there were only 144,000 seats to compete for. even though they weren't allegedly competing for these. They were that. How do you draw? How do you get interest into a movement in which there was no reward, nothing special for being a part of it? And so Rutherford changed that with the Jonadabs and the Great Multitude. And from that point on, there was no limit to how large Watchtower could grow. And so this was something I think that was in harmony with what Russell had in mind when he talked with Macmillan in his office shortly before Russell died. And Macmillan, in his 1959 Faith, or 57 Faith on the March, indicates that indeed the Watchtower had become the organization that Russell had envisioned. So I suspect that the Bible students really they're looking at Russell with rose-colored glasses and saying that there are allegations that Rutherford had usurped, had hijacked the society and changed it. I'm not so certain that he was actually doing that. I think that Rutherford was probably doing what Russell, he was working in harmony with Russell's vision for the Watchtower. And it only makes sense because this was Russell's organization. This was something that he began. He knew that he wasn't going to be around to finish this work, and he knew it was going to be left up to others, but I don't think that he would have opposed necessarily the changes that took place within the organization doctrinally. And the reason for that is they've always fallen back onto the convenient concept of new light or increasing light as time goes along. And this was established by Russell himself, and this excerpt from the first history book, Jehovah's Witnesses and the Divine Purpose, published in 1959, identifies an article or a statement made by Charles Russell where it's talking about keeping abreast of increasing light. And Russell himself spoke on that topic and said, "Some who have the three worlds was his first publication with Nelson Barber, or the old edition of Day Dawn, would perhaps like to know my present opinion of them, whether I still think them profitable books to loan to truth seekers. To this I reply, certainly not, because the very immature views of God's truth therein presented fall far short of what we now see to be God's wonderful plan. The Lord has taught me that it is a responsible matter to be a teacher, even to the extent of circulating a book or a paper. Even Food for Thinking Christians, now also out of print, I no longer commend because it is less systematic and therefore less clear." Russell promoted this idea that there was increasing light as the day dawn neared and approached. He did this in around 1907 when he changed a major doctrine concerning the covenants. For the greater part of his, let's call it ministry, from 1879 to about 1907, Russell taught that the new covenant, which was allegedly the covenant that the kingdom was supposed to be administrated under had already begun, and that the church class, again, because everybody who was being drawn into the Watchtower was allegedly being called to be part of the 144,000. And he changed his doctrine in that into a more confusing matter, where he indicated that those that were being drawn into the Watchtower's work were being drawn by the Abrahamic covenant, and that the new covenant was exclusively in the 1,000-year kingdom. And that was a huge change in doctrine, and it caused quite a bit of turmoil within the movement, even though at that time you could see that from the memorial figures the movement was only numbering in the thousands, maybe 10,000 worldwide. It wasn't a huge movement, but a pretty good proportion of individuals left, including two individuals, Ernest Hennings and his wife Rose Ball Hennings. Many of those familiar with Watchtower history are familiar with the infamous Rose Ball, who figured into the marital discord between Russell and his wife Maria. So it had this added benefit of cutting out and cutting off potential liabilities. It wasn't just enough for Russell to send them off to Australia. He made Hennings the branch head in Melbourne, Australia, and Rose went with him, his wife, at a time just before his trial began with Maria in 1903, when she sued for divorce from Russell, and Rose Ball was no longer available to testify because she was on a ship, a slow boat to Australia, literally halfway around the world. So, but Russell often had the strategic double advantages to things he did, like his move to Brooklyn. There were two strategic advantages, that one that benefited the society and another that benefited himself, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But Maria couldn't call Rose Ball to testify in her court trial against him, and Russell was willing to split the movement on a major doctrinal change. So he was not averse to doctrinal change and big ones when necessary. I think that with the evidence that the Watchtower had this potential of becoming a big thing, I mean, and we'll get into this a little bit. When you looked at the finances of the Watchtower in around 1911, 1912, maybe it was 1915, there was a court case where the Watchtower had sued the Brooklyn Eagle for $100,000 for libel. William Van Amberg was called to testify, and he gave some of the financial information about the Watchtower to the court, and it's clear that over the years, the 3 or 4 years preceding that court, that testimony that Van Amberg gave as treasurer of the Watchtower, the Watchtower had an equivalent amount of donations of 140, what would be equal today is $143 million. Now, we're talking about an organization that had membership in the thousands and didn't, I mean, it sourced out all of its printing. They hired printers. They didn't have their own factory. And there was an equivalent amount by today's standards of $143 million given to the Watchtower. That is a lot of money when you're talking about how quickly this thing grew after 1900. So I think Russell really understood the potential this thing had and wasn't averse to major doctrinal changes of truth on the basis of increasing light to strategic advantage to the society that he headed, and he had exclusive control over this. And we're going to look into the character of this guy, because I only got one viewpoint of him, and that viewpoint was, it elevated him to this, he was a biblical figure. He was the Laodicean messenger. He couldn't say anything wrong. If you stopped calling him Brother Russell, you were heading out of the truth. If you deviated from his writings, you were heading out of the truth. You shouldn't dare think for yourself. And he was this great, wise and wonderful man who everybody adored. And even today, there are many that quote from the reprints between 1879 and 1916, Russell's writings and statements, in some cases as frequently or not more frequently than from the Bible itself. So that tells you what Bible students think of him. But what was he really like? You know, there are other sources that indicate otherwise. Now, certainly Watchtower has taken a careful position on him, but they still acknowledge him as their leader. I find it interesting that as their history books go, their publications, there's less and less of him in it. Certainly the 1959 book, the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Divine Purpose, there are 359 references to Russell in that book throughout the entirety of the book. And it's over 300 pages. It's a sizable book. When you get to finally make it to 1993, the Proclaimer's book, he's mentioned and discussed in the early chapters, but far less frequently. And if you do a search on his name in jw.org, you'll find him, but he's not referred to very much, and neither is Rutherford. So there is this tendency to downplay the history, although, you know, every so often, I mean, there was a recent video about the end of the times of the Gentiles. They reenacted Russell coming in to the Bethel and announcing to the Bethel brethren, and they're all clapping enthusiastically at the announcement of the end of the times of the Gentiles, and how he as a prophet of truth, had predicted that. So, yeah, Watchtower, when it's to their advantage, will promote Russell, and the heritage, but it's decreasing over the course of time. And it's interesting to see that that happening. But not so with the Bible students. The Bible students are still Russell fanatics, and in a sense, Russellites. And Rutherford wasn't really too far off when he talked about those individuals, although he he calls them the evil servant class, because they wouldn't accept the new light that was coming from the channel, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. So he was that new light, and those that refused to accept the new light were those that were they were the virgins whose oil ran out of the lamps, and that they were worshiping the creature worship over the truth and new light. I'm sorry, I have to move away from that sun. So anyway, it's interesting to see that. But again, getting back to that point, and in that graph, that bar graph I had, that 75% dip, I shouldn't call that a dip, that's a precipitous plunge to 17,000, under 18,000 memorial partakers from 1927 to 1928. What was the cause of that? Did 1925 contribute? I suspect it did. The failed prediction. We didn't see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and David, and Moses, and Enoch, and all those ancient worthies, Rahab, walking around the earth announcing that they are in control of the earth. There was something else, though, because the memorial numbers didn't plunge immediately, right, the next year, which you would expect, and which did happen in 1975, as I mentioned earlier. So there must have been something else, something more, that could have contributed to this precipitous fall in numbers, which took a decade to recover, other than the failed prophecy. Just one more thing I want to point out about this graph. You see the yellow bars there. That is basically synthetic data. The blue bars are actual data. Those are real data points that I plotted for a particular year. Actual numbers that I got from and confirmed. I was able to confirm Paul Grundy's numbers, and I also got some numbers that he didn't publish on his webpage. But the yellow numbers are inferred. That's data that what they call synthetic data. I've taken graduate level statistical courses, and there are techniques that you can use to fill in data gaps. In some cases, they're very refined and are very good. In this case, I don't think I can say that. I just basically inferred step incremental increases to meet the number that I have confidence in, which was 1935. And then there was, again, data missing between 35 and 1939. Again, that's inferred. It's probably not too far from reality, but it's there to fill in for the eye, basically, to give you an idea that it took a while for the Watchtower to recover its numbers. So that's just an explanation there for that part of the graph. Now, with this portion, I am going to open up a table that I created. I think it's probably best that I do it here. It's in Excel, and let's open recent, and let's see, names. Okay, now what we have here is a table that I put together. Now, this data I got from Paul Grundy, the yearbooks that he has, some of the old yearbooks. And the yearbooks present the overall figures from the previous year. So the 29 yearbook represents 1928, and 1928 represents what happened in 1927. And in the yearbook, the elders that were associated with the Watchtower, that represented Watchtower, were called pilgrims. They were sent out to ecclesias all over the country, all over the world, on missionary work to serve Bible student ecclesias throughout the United States as Watchtower representatives. And in 1927, they called these individuals pilgrim speakers. These are the guys that got 85% or better on the test, that essay test, which again was somebody had to grade it on a subjective manner, not on any on any other basis. It was very subjective. But when you look at the number of names here, which were in alphabetical order, again, you can find this in the yearbook, the list of names. They were initially called pilgrim speakers. In later editions of the yearbook, they were called ordained ministers. Now, whoever had the ability to ordain them, I guess it was Judge Rutherford, but or the president of the society who followed Rutherford, but these individuals were named and listed in the yearbook, and that list grew over time. But in 1928, there were 266 individuals. I did the right here. I did the count. You could see right there, 266 in 1928. 1929, there were 222. So if you go by names alone, just by the number of names, there was a 16% decline, 16.5% decline. But it's interesting when you do a name-by-name comparison, which I did here. Now, I did this by the yearbooks are PDF form, and because they're old and the print is blurry and imperfect and small, there was a lot of work I had to do to get the names. I almost had to enter them in manually into the spreadsheet. It was not an easy thing. It wasn't a copy and paste deal, unfortunately. But I was able to get the names. And I had them listed in this table. There are 266, as you can see, listed down in column C, which shows all of the individuals named. Now, I created two columns because it would just keep going out. So column C and column F represent 1928, and column D and E and G and H are 1929. And I did a name-by-name comparison, and where you see in the 1929 columns the beige, that's where a name is missing. That's where this guy's just disappeared. For example, Kendall, George Kendall, was missing from the 1929 list. And I highlighted his name green because I knew his son, Mark Kendall. I was about 12, 13 years old. Mark was in his 20s, so he's older than me. He's probably in his 70s, maybe 80s now. Here's G.R. Pollock. And now, I knew Prosser, but Pollock was missing. Sargent was missing. Stamulus, who was an elder in New York, was missing. Many of these were elders in New York. E.R. Wilson wasn't, but Wilson was teamed with Woodworth, and they did the Frank and Ernest radio program together for many years. W.N. Woodworth was the founder of the Dawn magazine, and Zainow was a pilgrim speaker for the Dawn. He did a lot of the organizing of Bible students that withdrew from associating with Watchtower and ended up associating with the Dawn. And they did it very much the way Russell had it, the independent ecclesias that voted their own elders, and the Dawn acted as a service organization. But again, as I mentioned earlier, you could see that the Watchtower, unlike the Dawn, began to become a little bit more autocratic in its control under Russell himself. But I found that of the original 266 names, 87 were missing. 43 names were added to make up those that were gone. And so, even though there's a deficit in 1929, visually, when you looked at the list, you didn't see this sudden. It wasn't evident that this list was so much smaller. And so Rutherford filled many of the gaps in with individuals that were loyal to him, and these people left. And as far as I know, many of them didn't leave under their own, let's say, decision. They refused to go along with Rutherford's new light. They were loyal to Russell, and many of them were disfellowshipped. I know Woodworth was asked to leave, and he was disfellowshipped directly by Rutherford. Now, Woodworth was involved in the radio program WBBR, one of the radio programs there, and he took issue with Rutherford, or actually Rutherford took issue with Woodworth over the scripting of Woodworth's Frank and Ernest radio show, and said that he would write the script, and Woodworth said no thank you, and Rutherford said don't come back. So Woodworth, he didn't even get a lunch out of it. They disfellowshipped him, kicked him out of the Watchtower, put him out on the street. Several years later, 4 years later, Woodworth was responsible for starting the Dawn and starting the Frank and Ernest radio program again with John Dawson and later George Wilson. So I thought that this was interesting. It indicates that when you had such a large turnover in 1 year, it's suggestive of something. We saw that precipitous drop in memorial takers. There was a purge. And this that you can see if you look closely at the information in the yearbooks. But just just between 29 and 28, you could see that there was a substantial decline. In total, it was a 33%, one-third turnover within the Watchtower, and that's within the Watchtower. So you can see that it was possible that as many as 75% within the movement itself, it was a watershed year, let's put it that way, for the movement. There was a major split. And after that, 1929 marked the beginning of the general conventions. There was what they called a reunion Bible students convention for those that were disenfranchised from Watchtower, and they met at the old Bible House in Allegheny, Russell's original office location, and there were about 300 in attendance there, and it began the tradition that ended up being the Bible Students General Convention, which is still being held and is sponsored by the Dawn Bible Students. The Dawn Bible Students originated from the New York Bible Students Ecclesia in 1932. It was originally a Pastoral Bible Institute class, but they became less supportive of the PBI and became supportive of the Dawn, and a whole movement kind of grew out of the Dawn Bible Students. The Dawn got involved in a tax dispute with the town of East Rutherford in the mid-1940s. The Dawn, initially, its printing operations started in Brooklyn and on Fulton Street, and they moved out of Brooklyn from the Columbia Heights area to Rutherford, New Jersey, where they set up their operations, and they're still there in Rutherford, East Rutherford today, in the same building, although operations are greatly diminished. The Dawn Bible Students, they what was it I was going to say? They in 1946 got into a tax dispute with the town of East Rutherford, and in Superior Court, it was the Superior Court of New Jersey where the case was heard. Norman Woodworth was called to testify and explain to the judge who the Bible students were, who the Dawn Bible students were. And in that testimony, Woodworth indicated that there are 56,000 Bible students worldwide. And when you look at that memorial chart that I had, that there were 18,000 left, so 80,000. There were about 65,000, between 60 and 65,000 that are missing, that left, and so that's consistent with the information that was given in 1946 in court by Woodworth. It pretty much made up the majority of those who broke their association in 1928 with Watchtower, and so it's kind of interesting to see how these numbers fall together. You can find that case that I am referring to online if you do a search. East Rutherford versus the Dawn Bible Students, and it was a tax dispute. And by the way, the Dawn Bible Students lost that tax dispute and paid $27,000 in taxes owed, property taxes. So if I had taken the Pilgrims list from 1930 or 31 in the yearbook, 30 or 31, and compared it against the 1927 figures, I'm sure that there would be even greater number of individuals missing from the list. There are some individuals on that list that were elders in my class that didn't leave the Jehovah's Witnesses or leave the Watchtower. They weren't yet called witnesses in 1928. But I recognize them, like the last name Macaulay, J. Macaulay. He was Jack Macaulay. He was an elder in the New York Bible Students Ecclesia when I was a kid, and he was somebody that didn't tolerate children. If a child spoke during his talk, he would stop his talk, call out the parent of that child, and would threaten the parent to either take the child out, or he would not give the remainder of his talk unless that child was quiet. He was a piece of work. He had been a Canadian mounted police officer before he joined the Bible Students and the Watchtower Association. And he was a gruff, and he was a bachelor. He couldn't live with anybody. There was no way somebody could live with a person who was so intolerant, especially of children. But I see that, again, this segment is long, and so there were, again, this little study research that I've embarked in led me to other things, especially in looking into the character of Charles Russell, because that's what this split was about. It was about individuals that Rutherford called the evil servant. Now, they're even identified in that Jehovah's Witness in the Divine Purpose book. Look up evil servant, and you'll find that they're the ones that didn't conform to the new light. In the 1932 yearbook, also look up what Rutherford has to say about the name change, because the name change took place in 1931, and about those others. Now, he says it was done to avoid confusion from those that identified as Standfast, Bible Students, Millennial Daunists, Russellites, and so on. And the Jehovah's Witness name was supposed to remove that confusion. But he identifies these individuals as the evil servant who persecutes the true servants. Well, you can see that the Watchtower really took quite a hit. It was growing. It was growing rapidly, but with 1928, the failed 1925 prediction, along with an apparent purge that took place, that's indicated by the numbers of the missing, the 87 missing from 29 to 28, or 28 to 29. That's a substantial drop, and that are those that are within the organization. It could be even greater number, that, and obviously it was, because the memorial figures show it. So I'm going to finish this portion of it, and I guess part 3 will be next. I just didn't want to make a 3-hour video, so the next part's coming up, and there should be some interesting information in there where we get a little closer look at Russell and his relationship with his wife and family, and what those can indicate to us. There's an awful lot written about Russell online, and I wanted to get it from sources that had some degree of, let's say, credibility or reliability than somebody's website, you know. And I've noticed in looking at websites that much of the information has a ring of truth in it, but deviates from what, let's say, documented sources may say a little bit. But anyway, we'll end it here, and we'll call part 3 coming up.